The morning sun cast long shadows across the marble floors of Aldoria Palace as Captain Marcus Stone made his way through the corridors he had protected for nearly 2 decades. His boots echoed against the polished stone, each step heavy with the weight of the secret that had been consuming him for months. Today, everything would change. King Edward VII sat in his private study, reviewing state documents with the same meticulous attention he had given to royal duties for 30 years. At 68, his once golden hair had turned silver, but his blue eyes remained sharp and commanding. The crown had aged him, as it did all who wore it, but he wore that burden with dignity. "Your Majesty," Captain Stone announced himself at the doorway, his usually steady voice carrying an unusual tremor. The king looked up from his papers, noting the unusual pallor in his most trusted guard's face. "Marcus, you look as though you've seen a ghost. What troubles you?" Stone stepped forward, clutching a manila envelope that seemed to burn in his hands. For months he had debated whether to reveal what he had discovered. His loyalty to the crown had always been absolute, but his conscience demanded truth. "Your Majesty, I have discovered something that I believe you must know, though it pains me greatly to be the bearer of such news." Stone's voice cracked slightly as he placed the envelope on the king's desk. Edward's expression grew serious. In his years as monarch, he had received many troubling reports, but something in Stone's demeanor suggested this was different. "Speak freely, old friend." Stone took a deep breath, his hands trembling slightly. "Sir, it concerns Prince Alexander. I have reason to believe that certain medical records may have been altered over the years." The king's face remained impassive, though his knuckles whitened as he gripped his pen. "What manner of alterations?" "DNA testing records, Your Majesty. I discovered discrepancies while reviewing security protocols for the medical wing. Dr. Cross's predecessor, Dr. Whitmore, kept detailed backup files that don't match the official records." Stone's words came out in a rush, as if speaking them quickly might lessen their impact. Edward set down his pen and leaned back in his chair. The weight of the crown suddenly felt heavier than ever. "Are you suggesting what I think you're suggesting?" "I'm suggesting nothing, Your Majesty. I'm merely presenting facts that require your attention." Stone opened the envelope and spread several documents across the desk. "These are copies of the original test results from 28 years ago, and these are the official records currently in the royal medical files." The king studied the papers in silence, his trained eye quickly identifying the inconsistencies Stone had discovered. The dates were the same, the official seals appeared authentic, but the genetic markers told a completely different story. "How long have you known about this?" Edward's voice was barely above a whisper. 3 months, Your Majesty. I have spent that time verifying the authenticity of these documents and exploring every possible explanation for the discrepancies. Edward stood and walked to the tall windows overlooking the palace gardens, where he could see Prince Alexander playing with his own children on the lawn. Alexander had always been the perfect heir, intelligent, charismatic, beloved by the people. The thought that he might not be his biological son sent shockwaves through everything Edward believed about his family and his legacy. "Who else knows of this?" "No one, Your Majesty. I felt it was my duty to bring this to you first." The king remained silent for several long minutes, watching his son, the man he had raised, groomed, and loved as his heir, laugh with his grandchildren. The sound of their joy drifted through the windows, a stark contrast to the turmoil now raging in his heart. "Marcus, I want you to arrange for new independent testing. Use a facility outside the kingdom, one with no connections to our royal physicians. I need to know the truth, whatever it may be." Stone nodded solemnly. "Of course, Your Majesty." "Shall I inform Prince Alexander?" "No." The word came out sharper than Edward intended. "Not yet. If these allegations prove true, I need time to consider the implications for the crown, for the kingdom, and for the family." As Stone prepared to leave, Edward called after him. "Marcus, your loyalty to the truth, though painful, does you credit. Whatever comes of this, remember that you have served the crown with honor." Alone in his study, King Edward stared at the documents spread across his desk. Each page seemed to mock the life he thought he had lived, the son he thought he had raised. If Prince Alexander was not his biological child, then who was he? And more importantly, who was his real father? The afternoon sun began to set, casting the study in golden hues that reminded Edward of happier times. He thought of Alexander's birth, how Queen Isabella had glowed with maternal joy, how proud he had been to hold his heir for the first time. Had it all been a lie? His mind raced through memories, searching for signs he might have missed. Alexander's artistic temperament, so different from his own pragmatic nature, his easy charm with people, a quality that had always seemed to come more naturally to him than it ever had to Edward. Were these simply individual traits, or clues to a different parentage? The king reached for his private phone and dialed Dr. Helena Cross, the current royal physician. "Helena, I need to see you immediately. There's a matter of utmost confidentiality that requires your expertise." As he waited for Dr. Santis Cross to arrive, Edward walked to his private safe and withdrew a small velvet box containing items from Alexander's childhood. A lock of hair from his first haircut, baby teeth, small mementos that a loving father keeps. If new testing was required, these items would provide the genetic material needed for comparison. The knock on his door came exactly 20 minutes later. Dr. Cross entered, her professional demeanor immediately shifting to concern when she saw the king's expression. "Your Majesty, you look distressed. Are you feeling unwell?" "My health is fine, Helena. It's my peace of mind that's in question." Edward gestured to the chair across from his desk. "I need you to arrange for genetic testing, but it must be done with complete discretion." Dr. Cross sat down, her medical training evident in the way she immediately focused on his needs without asking unnecessary questions. "What type of testing do you require?" "Paternity testing." The words felt foreign in his mouth, as if speaking them made the situation more real. "I have reason to believe that previous medical records may have been compromised." The doctor's professionalism never wavered, though Edward caught a brief flicker of surprise in her eyes. "I can arrange for testing at a private facility in Switzerland. They specialize in confidential genetic analysis for high-profile clients. How long for results? Given the priority and confidentiality requirements?" "Approximately 1 week." Edward nodded, then handed her the velvet box. "Use these samples for comparison with Prince Alexander's DNA. I trust you understand the sensitive nature of this request." Dr. Cross accepted the box with the gravity the situation deserved. "Your Majesty, I want you to know that whatever the results may be, my loyalty is to the crown and to the truth." After Dr. Dottie Cross departed, Edward found himself alone with thoughts that threatened to overwhelm him. If Alexander was not his son, the implications extended far beyond personal betrayal. The line of succession would be called into question. The legitimacy of the crown itself could be challenged. The kingdom's stability might hang in the balance. But beyond the political ramifications, there was the human cost. Alexander was not just the heir apparent, he was the man Edward had raised, guided, and loved as his own flesh and blood. How do you look at someone you've called son for 28 years and see a stranger? The king made a decision that would haunt him for the coming week. He would continue to interact with Alexander as normal, but he would also begin to observe him with new eyes, searching for truths he might have overlooked for nearly 3 decades. As night fell over Aldoria Palace, King Edward sat in his study surrounded by the weight of secrets and the fear of what truths the coming days might reveal. The crown that had always been his burden now felt like it might crush him entirely. The first part of this royal drama had begun, setting in motion events that would shake the very foundations of the monarchy, and force a family to confront lies that had shaped their lives for nearly 30 years. The week that followed Captain Stone's revelation passed like a nightmare from which King Edward could not wake. Every interaction with Prince Alexander felt like walking through a minefield of emotions and unspoken questions. The king found himself studying his heir's features during state meetings, searching for resemblances that he had never questioned before. Prince Alexander, unaware of the storm brewing around him, continued his royal duties with his characteristic grace and dedication. At 28, he had grown into everything a future king should be: diplomatic, intelligent, and genuinely caring about the welfare of their people. Yet now, every one of these admirable qualities felt like salt in Edward's wounds. "Father, you seem distracted lately," Alexander observed during their weekly private meeting to discuss kingdom affairs. "The ministers have noticed. Is there something troubling you?" Edward looked up from the papers he had been pretending to read. meeting his son's concerned gaze. Those eyes green like Isabella's, he had always thought, though now he wondered if they resembled someone else entirely. "The responsibilities of the crown weigh heavily sometimes," Edward replied. Which was true, though not in the way Alexander would understand. "Tell me about the trade negotiations with the northern provinces." Alexander launched into a detailed report, his insights sharp and his proposed solutions innovative. He was every inch the future king that Edward had hoped to raise, which made the possibility of losing him even more devastating. Dr. Cross had called that morning with the results. The genetic testing facility in Switzerland had completed their analysis, and she requested an immediate private meeting. Edward had postponed it twice, not ready to face whatever truth awaited him. But he could postpone it no longer. That evening, after Alexander had left for his own apartments within the palace, Edward summoned Dr. Cross to his study. She arrived carrying a sealed envelope, her professional composure intact but her eyes betraying the gravity of what she carried. "Your Majesty," she began, settling into the chair across from his desk. "I have the results you requested." Edward's hands remained steady as he accepted the envelope, though his heart hammered against his ribs. "Before you tell me what they contain, I want you to know that whatever we learn tonight, it stays between us until I decide otherwise." "Of course, Your Majesty." Edward broke the seal and withdrew the documents. The scientific terminology was complex, but the conclusion was devastatingly clear. The genetic markers did not match. Prince Alexander was not his biological son. The silence in the study stretched on as Edward read and reread the results, hoping to find some error, some alternative explanation. But the science was irrefutable. The man he had raised as his heir, loved as his son, and prepared to inherit the crown, was not related to him by blood. "How accurate are these results?" he asked finally. 99.9% accurate, Your Majesty. I had them run the tests twice to be certain." Edward set the papers down and walked to his window, staring out at the palace grounds, where Alexander had played as a child, where Edward had taught him to ride horses, where they had shared countless father-son moments that now felt like memories belonging to someone else's life. "Dr. Cross, I need you to arrange for additional testing. More genetic analysis, Your Majesty?" "No. I want to know who his biological father is." The words tasted bitter. "Can that be determined from these samples?" Dr. Cross considered the request carefully. "It's possible to develop a genetic profile that could be compared against potential matches, but, Your Majesty, such testing would require samples from suspected individuals." Edward turned back to face her, his expression grim. "Then we'll need to be creative about how we obtain them." Over the next several days, Edward found himself in the unusual position of playing detective within his own family. He began to think back to the time around Alexander's conception, trying to remember who had been close to Queen Isabella, who had had access to the royal quarters, who might have been involved in such a deception. Queen Isabella had died 5 years earlier from cancer, taking with her any chance of confronting her directly about the truth. But there had been whispers over the years, court gossip that Edward had dismissed as the idle chatter of bored courtiers. Now those whispers took on new significance. He remembered Lord Vincent Ashworth, Isabella's close childhood friend who had served as a diplomatic advisor during the early years of their marriage. Vincent had been charming, artistic, and had possessed the kind of easy social grace that Alexander displayed. More troubling still, Vincent had left the kingdom abruptly about 6 months after Alexander's birth, citing personal reasons. Edward instructed Captain Stone to discreetly locate Lord Ashworth. If he was still alive, they would need to find a way to obtain genetic material for comparison. It was a task that would require delicacy and absolute secrecy. Meanwhile, Edward struggled with the growing distance he felt from Alexander. During their daily interactions, he found himself unable to connect with the warmth and affection that had always characterized their relationship. Alexander began to notice. "Father, have I done something to displease you?" Alexander asked after a particularly strained conversation about agricultural reforms. "You seem distant, almost cold." Edward wanted to embrace him, to tell him that nothing had changed, but the truth created a barrier that he couldn't cross. "You have done nothing wrong, Alexander. I've simply had much on my mind regarding the kingdom's future." But Alexander was too intelligent not to sense the change. Is this about the succession? Have you decided to delay my taking on additional responsibilities? The irony was almost too much to bear. Here was Alexander, worried about his royal future, unaware that his entire identity as heir to the throne might be built on a lie. Your preparation to eventually lead this kingdom remains unchanged, Edward said carefully. The truth was, he didn't know what Alexander's future held anymore. Captain Stone returned 3 days later with information about Lord Ashworth. He was living quietly in a small estate in France, having never married or had children of his own. He was 55 years old and reportedly in poor health. Approaching him directly would be complicated, Stone reported. However, he does visit a particular cafe in Paris every Tuesday morning. It might be possible to obtain genetic material from items he uses there. Edward nodded grimly. The lengths to which he was going to uncover the truth felt extreme, but he needed to know. The kingdom's future, and his own peace of mind, depended on having all the facts. As the arrangements were being made for the covert collection of genetic material from Lord Ashworth, Edward found himself watching Alexander with new eyes during a state dinner. The prince moved through the crowd of diplomats and dignitaries with natural ease, his conversation intelligent and engaging, his presence commanding respect without demanding it. Whether or not Alexander was his biological son, Edward realized, he had become a remarkable man and would likely make an excellent king. But the question of legitimacy loomed large. If the truth came out, it could destabilize not just the monarchy, but the entire kingdom. Late that night, alone in his chambers, Edward made a decision that would haunt him. He would wait for the final genetic tests to confirm Lord Ashworth's paternity. If they proved positive, he would have to confront the most difficult choice of his reign, protect the lie that had shaped their lives, or expose the truth that could destroy everything they had built. The weight of the crown had never felt heavier, and Edward wondered if some secrets were too dangerous to reveal, even when the truth demanded it. The second part of this royal crisis was drawing to a close, but the most difficult challenges still lay ahead. In the distance, he could hear Alexander's laughter echoing through the palace corridors as he returned from the state dinner. Soon, that laughter might turn to shock, anger, or worse. Edward closed his eyes and tried to prepare himself for the confrontation that seemed increasingly inevitable. The truth was coming, whether he was ready for it or not. The call came on a Tuesday morning, 2 weeks after Captain Stone had returned from France. Cross's voice was steady but carried an undercurrent of tension that Edward had come to dread during these clandestine conversations. "Your Majesty, the results from the second round of testing are ready. I believe we should meet immediately." Edward glanced at his schedule. He had a morning session with Parliament, followed by a luncheon with trade representatives from neighboring kingdoms. The business of ruling continued even as his personal world crumbled around him. This evening, after the state functions conclude, the usual discretion applies. That day proved to be one of the longest of Edward's life. During parliamentary session, he found his attention wandering as ministers debated agricultural subsidies and infrastructure spending. His responses were mechanical, his mind consumed by the envelope waiting in Dr. Cross's possession. Prince Alexander attended the luncheon, as he often did to gain experience in diplomatic relations. Edward watched him navigate conversations with foreign dignitaries, noting how naturally Alexander connected with people, how his genuine interest in their concerns created instant rapport. "Your son is impressive," commented Ambassador Martinez from the neighboring kingdom of Castoria. "He has a natural diplomatic gift. You must be very proud." The word son hit Edward like a physical blow. "Alexander has always been dedicated to serving the kingdom," he replied carefully, avoiding the familial claim he had made thousands of times before. As evening approached, Edward's anxiety intensified. He dismissed his personal secretary early and waited in his study for Dr. Cross's arrival. When she knocked precisely at 8 o'clock, he felt as though he were about to learn his own death sentence. Dr. Cross entered with her familiar professional composure, but Edward noticed the way she clutched the envelope slightly tighter than usual. She sat down and met his gaze directly. "Your Majesty, the genetic comparison between Prince Alexander and the sample obtained from Lord Vincent Ashworth shows a 99.8% probability of paternal relationship." The words seemed to echo in the sudden silence. Edward had been preparing himself for this confirmation, but hearing it spoken aloud made it devastatingly real. Alexander was not his son. Vincent Ashworth, his late wife's childhood friend, was Alexander's biological father. "There can be no doubt?" Edward asked, though he already knew the answer. "None, Your Majesty. The genetic markers are consistent across multiple test points." Edward stood and walked to his private bar, pouring himself a scotch, with hands that trembled slightly. He offered one to Dr. Cross, who declined with a shake of her head. Dr. D. Cross, I want you to prepare a comprehensive report, including all the testing results, the timeline of events, and any relevant medical records. Seal it and place it in the royal vault. This information must be preserved, but access to it will be restricted to the monarch and his designated heir. Of course, Your Majesty. And regarding Prince Alexander? Edward took a long sip of scotch, feeling the burn as it went down. That decision remains mine to make. After Dr. Cross departed, Edward sat alone with the weight of absolute knowledge. Alexander was not his biological son, but rather the result of an affair between Queen Isabella and Lord Vincent Ashworth. The implications were staggering. Over the following days, Edward found himself studying Alexander with new understanding. The artistic sensitivity that had always seemed unusual in the pragmatic royal bloodline now made sense. Vincent had been a patron of the arts, a painter himself. Alexander's natural diplomatic skills, his ability to read people and situations intuitively, these traits now had a different source. But beyond the genetics, there was the question of what to do with this information. Alexander had been raised as the heir, groomed for leadership, and accepted by the people as their future king. He had done nothing wrong, yet his entire identity was built on a deception. Edward's internal struggle intensified when Alexander approached him about taking on additional royal responsibilities. "Father, I've been thinking about the upcoming trade summit with the Eastern Alliance. I'd like to take the lead on those negotiations," Alexander said during their weekly meeting. The word father cut through Edward like a blade. How many times had Alexander called him that over the years? How many times had Edward felt the warm pride of hearing it? Now it felt like a lie repeated endlessly. "The Eastern Alliance negotiations are complex," Edward replied stiffly. "Perhaps you should observe this time." Alexander's expression shifted to confusion. For weeks now, Edward had been pulling back from their close working relationship, and Alexander was beginning to notice the pattern. "Have I made some error in judgment? My preparation for the role of heir apparent was progressing well until recently. Now you seem hesitant to trust me with significant responsibilities." Edward looked at the young man across from him. Intelligent, capable, everything a future king should be, yet not his son. The irony was bitter. "Your capabilities are not in question," Edward said carefully. "Then what is? Please, speak frankly with me. This distance between us is affecting not just our personal relationship, but our ability to work together for the kingdom." Edward felt the walls closing in. Alexander was too perceptive to be deflected much longer. Soon he would demand answers that Edward wasn't prepared to give. That evening, Edward made a decision that would set everything in motion. He called Captain Stone to his study. "Marcus, I want you to prepare a detailed investigation into Queen Isabella's activities during the period of Alexander's conception. I need to understand exactly how this deception was carried out and who else might have been involved." Stone nodded grimly. "Your Majesty, are you certain you want to pursue this path? Some knowledge, once gained, cannot be forgotten." "The knowledge already exists," Edward replied. "Now I need to understand its full implications." The investigation that followed revealed a carefully orchestrated deception. Medical records showed that Isabella had made several private trips to a countryside estate during the crucial period. Lord Vincent Ashworth had been there at the same time, ostensibly for diplomatic meetings that, upon closer examination, appeared to have been fabricated. More disturbing still was evidence that Dr. Whitmore, the former royal physician, had been involved in altering the original DNA records. Financial records showed unusual payments to Dr. Whitmore shortly after Alexander's birth, payments that had no official explanation. The scope of the conspiracy was broader than Edward had imagined. It wasn't simply an affair that had resulted in pregnancy. It was a deliberate plan to place Vincent Ashworth's son on the throne of Aldoria. As Edward processed this information, His anger grew not just at the betrayal, but at the way he had been manipulated for nearly 3 decades. Every moment of pride in Alexander's accomplishments now felt tainted by the knowledge that he had been raising another man's son to inherit his crown. The breaking point came during a state dinner celebrating the anniversary of Edward's coronation. Alexander gave a speech about the honor of serving the crown and his gratitude for the example his father had set. The words of love and respect, delivered so sincerely, felt like knives to Edward's heart. After the guests had departed, Edward found Alexander in the palace library, reviewing documents for upcoming legislation. "Alexander, I need to speak with you privately." Something in Edward's tone made Alexander look up with immediate attention. "Of course, father. What is it?" Edward closed the library doors and turned to face the young man who had called him father for 28 years, knowing that this conversation would destroy that relationship forever. "There are matters concerning your birth that have come to light, matters that change everything about who you are and your place in this family." Alexander set down his documents, his expression growing serious. "What kind of matters?" Edward took a deep breath, steeling himself for the most difficult conversation of his life. The third part of this crisis was about to give way to direct confrontation, and neither of their lives would ever be the same. "Genetic testing has revealed that you are not my biological son." The words hung in the air between them like a death sentence, and Edward watched as everything Alexander thought he knew about himself began to crumble. The silence in the library stretched on for what felt like an eternity. Alexander's face went through a series of expressions: confusion, disbelief, and finally, a dawning horror as the implications of his father's words began to sink in. "That's impossible," Alexander whispered, his voice barely audible. "You're my father. You've always been my father." Edward's heart broke watching the young man he had raised struggle with this revelation, but his anger at the deception that had shaped their lives kept his voice cold and steady. "The genetic testing is conclusive. You are not my biological son, Alexander. You are the son of Lord Vincent Ashworth." Alexander stood up abruptly, nearly knocking over his chair. "Vincent Ashworth? Mother's friend? That's absurd. Why would you even suggest such a thing?" Edward pulled out copies of the genetic test results and placed them on the library table. "The evidence is irrefutable. Your mother had an affair, and you are the product of that affair. Everything about your identity, your place in the succession, your entire life has been built on a lie." Alexander stared at the documents as if they were written in a foreign language. "Even if this were true, and I'm not saying it is, why are you telling me this? What do you want from me?" The question struck Edward as naive, almost childishly so. "What I want? I want the truth acknowledged. I want to understand how I was deceived for nearly 30 years. I want to know who else was involved in this conspiracy to place another man's son on my throne." Alexander's voice began to rise, anger replacing shock. "I've spent my entire life preparing to serve this kingdom. I've dedicated every day to being worthy of the responsibility you gave me. And now you're questioning my right to it based on biology?" Edward's own anger flared. "Biology is exactly what matters when it comes to royal succession. The crown passes through bloodlines, not through good intentions or noble character. You are not of royal blood." Alexander began pacing the library, his hands running through his hair in distress. "So what are you saying, that everything I've worked for, everything I've believed about myself is meaningless?" "I'm saying that you are not my son," Edward replied harshly. "You are not the heir to this throne. You are the bastard child of my wife's affair with a man who fled the kingdom shortly after your birth." The cruel words hit Alexander like physical blows. He stopped pacing and turned to face Edward, his eyes blazing with hurt and fury. "Bastard child? Is that how you see me now? After 28 years of calling me son, of teaching me, of telling me you were proud of me." Edward's resolve wavered slightly at the pain in Alexander's voice, but he pushed forward. "Those 28 years were based on a lie. Every moment of pride, every lesson I taught you, every time I looked at you and saw my future king, it was all false." Alexander laughed bitterly. "False? Was it false when I stayed by your side during your illness 3 years ago? Was it false when I worked 18-hour days to help manage the kingdom during the economic crisis? Was it false when I gave up personal relationships and normal experiences to dedicate myself to this crown?" You did those things as an imposter, Edward shot back, the words coming out harsher than he intended. You benefited from a position that was never rightfully yours. The accusation hung in the air between them like a sword. Alexander's expression shifted from hurt to something harder, more resolute. An imposter, he repeated quietly. Is that truly what you believe? Edward wanted to take back the word the moment he said it, but his pride and pain kept him silent. Alexander nodded slowly, as if something had been decided. If that's how you see me, then perhaps it's time I stopped pretending to be your son. Alexander turned toward the door, but Edward called after him. Where are you going? To pack my belongings. If I'm not your son, then I have no place in the royal family. I'll leave the palace tonight. Panic flashed through Edward at the thought of Alexander actually leaving. Despite everything, despite the anger and betrayal he felt, the thought of losing Alexander entirely was unbearable. You can't just leave. There are protocols, procedures. The people expect... Alexander turned back, his expression now cold and distant. The people expect their future king to be legitimate. According to you, I'm not, so I'm solving your problem. It's not that simple. Your departure would raise questions. There would be speculation, investigations. Then tell them the truth, Alexander said with bitter finality. Tell them that their beloved prince is actually a bastard who has no right to the throne. I'm sure that will go over well. Edward realized he was losing control of the situation. This confrontation wasn't going as he had imagined. He had expected Alexander to fight for his position, to deny the results, to show some of the political cunning that would be necessary to navigate this crisis. Instead, Alexander was simply walking away. Alexander, wait. We need to discuss this rationally. Alexander paused at the library door. Rationally? You've just destroyed my entire identity and called me an imposter. What exactly is there to discuss rationally? Your future. The kingdom's future. This doesn't have to mean the end of everything. Alexander's laugh was hollow. Doesn't it? You've made it clear that biology is all that matters for royal succession. I don't have the right biology, so I don't have a future here. Edward struggled to find words that could bridge the chasm that had opened between them. You could remain in the palace, take on other duties. Your experience and knowledge wouldn't be wasted. The suggestion sounded pathetic, even to Edward's own ears. Alexander's expression confirmed it. Remain as what? Your charity case? The former prince who gets to stay around out of pity? Alexander shook his head. I have more dignity than that. As Alexander reached for the door handle, Edward made one final desperate attempt to maintain some control over the situation. If you leave with nothing. No title, no inheritance, no support from the crown. You'll be entirely on your own. Alexander turned back one final time, and Edward saw something in his eyes that he had never seen before. A complete absence of the love and respect that had always been there. I've been on my own since the moment you decided I wasn't worthy of being called your son, Alexander said quietly. The only difference now is that I know it. With that, Alexander walked out of the library, leaving Edward alone with the genetic test results and the devastating realization that in his quest for truth, he might have destroyed the most important relationship in his life. Over the following hours, Edward heard the sounds of movement from Alexander's apartments. Drawers opening and closing, items being packed. By morning, Alexander was gone, having left the palace before dawn, with only the belongings he could carry. Captain Stone found Edward in his study the next morning, staring out the window at the gardens where Alexander had played as a child. Your Majesty, Prince Alexander's departure has been noticed by the staff. What shall I tell them? Edward continued, staring out the window, watching the empty space where Alexander's laughter used to echo through the corridors. Tell them that Prince Alexander is taking some time away from the palace for personal reflection. But even as he said the words, Edward knew that Alexander wasn't coming back. In his determination to confront the lies that had shaped their lives, he had driven away the young man who, regardless of biology, had been the best thing in his world for 28 years. The fourth part of this royal crisis had ended with a family shattered, a kingdom without its heir, and a king who was beginning to realize that truth and justice weren't always the same thing. 3 months had passed since Alexander left the palace, and the kingdom of Aldoria was beginning to show signs of strain. Official explanations about the prince's temporary absence for personal reflection had grown thin, and speculation was mounting among both the nobility and the common people. King Edward sat in his study, looking older than his 68 years. The weight of ruling without an heir apparent, combined with the guilt of driving away Alexander, had taken its toll. Dark circles shadowed his eyes, and his usually impeccable posture had developed a slight stoop. Captain Stone entered with the day's security briefings, but Edward could tell from his expression that there was more troubling news. "Your Majesty, we've received reports about Prince Alexander's activities since his departure." Edward looked up sharply. He had instructed Stone to keep track of Alexander's whereabouts, though he told himself it was purely for security reasons. The truth was more complicated. Despite everything, he couldn't stop worrying about the young man he had raised. "What kind of activities?" Stone placed a folder on the desk. "He's been working with humanitarian organizations in the outer provinces, helping with flood relief efforts, organizing medical clinics for remote villages, that sort of thing. The local population has embraced him enthusiastically." Edward opened the folder and found photographs of Alexander, dressed in simple work clothes, helping to build temporary shelters and distribute food to flood victims. His face looked thinner than before, but there was something in his expression, a sense of purpose that Edward recognized. "He's not using his royal title?" "No, Your Majesty. He's introduced himself simply as Alexander Ashworth." The name hit Edward like a physical blow. By taking Vincent Ashworth's surname, Alexander was publicly acknowledging his true parentage while simultaneously rejecting his royal heritage. It was both a gesture of acceptance and an act of defiance. "The people don't seem to care about his lack of royal title," Stone continued. "If anything, his willingness to work alongside them has increased their admiration. Some of the provincial governors have requested that he coordinate additional relief efforts in their regions." Edward studied the photographs more closely. In one image, Alexander was kneeling beside an elderly woman, bandaging her injured hand with careful attention. In another, he was laughing with a group of children while helping to serve meals at a temporary shelter. These weren't photo opportunities or official royal visits, they were genuine human connections. "Has he made any statements about the royal family or his departure from the palace?" "None, Your Majesty. When asked about his absence from court, he simply says he's chosen to serve the kingdom in a different capacity." Edward felt a pang of something he couldn't quite identify. Pride mixed with regret. Even exiled from the royal family, Alexander was still serving Aldoria's people with the same dedication he had shown as prince. The irony wasn't lost on Edward that in trying to preserve the integrity of the crown, he had banished perhaps the most naturally gifted leader the kingdom had ever produced. The political implications of Alexander's continued presence in the kingdom were becoming increasingly complex. Duke Marchand, the king's chief advisor, had been pressing for an official announcement about the succession. "Your Majesty, the uncertainty about Prince Alexander's status is creating instability," the Duke had argued during their last meeting. "Parliament is beginning to ask direct questions about the line of succession. We need clarity." But clarity was exactly what Edward couldn't provide. Revealing the truth about Alexander's parentage would create a scandal that could shake the monarchy to its foundations. Lying about his temporary absence was becoming increasingly difficult as the months stretched on. The crisis deepened when Ambassador Martinez from Castoria requested a private audience. Edward received him in his formal meeting chamber, hoping this was routine diplomatic business. But the ambassador's expression suggested otherwise. "Your Majesty, I must speak frankly about a delicate matter. There are rumors circulating among neighboring kingdoms about internal conflict within the Aldorian royal family." Edward kept his expression neutral. "Rumors are common in diplomatic circles, Ambassador. I hope you don't give them credence." Normally, I would not. However, these rumors specifically concern Prince Alexander's absence and suggest that it may be permanent. If true, this has implications for existing trade agreements and diplomatic arrangements that were predicated on the stability of your succession. The ambassador's meaning was clear. Other kingdoms were beginning to question Aldoria's political stability, which could affect everything from economic partnerships to military alliances. "I assure you that the kingdom's succession remains secure," Edward replied, though the words felt hollow even as he spoke them. After the ambassador departed, Edward found himself facing the truth he had been avoiding for months. His actions had created a crisis that extended far beyond his personal relationship with Alexander. The kingdom itself was beginning to suffer from the uncertainty he had created. That evening, Edward made a decision that would have seemed impossible 3 months earlier. He summoned Dr. Cross to his study and requested that she arrange a private meeting with Alexander. "I assume he won't come to the palace," Edward said. "We'll need to meet somewhere neutral." Dr. Cross nodded. "I can arrange for a meeting at the old chapel in Millbrook. It's remote enough to ensure privacy, but accessible for both of you." 2 days later, Edward found himself traveling in an unmarked carriage to a small chapel in the countryside, accompanied only by a single bodyguard. The journey gave him time to think about what he would say to Alexander, how he could possibly bridge the chasm he had created between them. The chapel was simple and weathered, its stone walls covered with ivy. Edward arrived first and waited in the dim interior lit only by afternoon sunlight filtering through stained glass windows. When Alexander appeared in the doorway, Edward was struck by how much he had changed. Alexander looked healthier despite the obvious physical demands of his humanitarian work. There was a calmness about him that hadn't been there before, as if he had found peace with his new identity. But when he saw Edward, his expression hardened. "Your Majesty," Alexander said formally, offering a slight bow that managed to be respectful while maintaining distance. "Alexander," Edward replied, his voice catching slightly on the name. "Thank you for agreeing to meet with me." They sat in adjacent pews, close enough to speak privately but with space between them that felt symbolic of their fractured relationship. "I've been following your work in the provinces," Edward began. "The people speak highly of your efforts." Alexander's expression didn't soften. "The people in the outer provinces have been neglected for years. Someone needed to help them." "You're right. The crown should have been more attentive to their needs." "The crown has many responsibilities," Alexander replied diplomatically, though Edward caught the subtle criticism in his tone. Edward struggled to find the right words to bridge the gap between them. "Alexander, I asked you to come here because I've realized that my reaction to learning about your parentage was excessive." Alexander raised an eyebrow. "Excessive? You called me a bastard and an imposter, then told me I had no right to the throne I'd spent my life preparing to inherit." The words stung because they were accurate. Edward had let his anger and sense of betrayal drive him to cruelty that he now regretted. I was dealing with my own sense of betrayal. Learning that everything I believed about our family was based on deception, it changed how I saw everything, including you. "And how do you see me now?" Alexander asked quietly. Edward looked at the young man he had raised, seeing not just Vincent Ashworth's biological son, but the person Alexander had become through 28 years of love, guidance, and shared experiences. "I see someone who has served this kingdom with more dedication and natural ability than any heir in our history. I see someone who, regardless of biology, became everything a future king should be." Alexander was quiet for a long moment, processing Edward's words. "But you still don't see your son." The question went to the heart of everything. Edward realized that biology had become less important than the years of relationship they had shared, but the damage from his initial reaction might be irreversible. "I see the young man I raised and loved for 28 years. I see someone I failed badly when he needed my support most." Alexander stood up and walked to one of the stained glass windows, his back to Edward. "Do you know what the hardest part has been? Not losing the title or the palace or the privileges. It's been losing the father who taught me everything I know about leadership, about service, about being a decent human being." Edward felt tears he had been holding back for months finally begin to fall. "You haven't lost that, Alexander. I'm still here." Alexander turned around and Edward saw that he too was struggling with emotion. "Are you? Because the man who raised me would never have called me an imposter. The man who raised me would have found a way to work through this crisis together instead of driving me away." Edward stood and approached Alexander, stopping just close enough to see the pain in his eyes. "You're right. The man who raised you was better than the man who learned about your parentage. I let anger and betrayal turn me into someone I don't recognize." "So what happens now?" Alexander asked. "I can't pretend to be your biological son, and you can't pretend that doesn't matter to you." Edward had been wrestling with exactly that question for weeks. "I don't know," he admitted. But I know that the kingdom needs you, even if not in the way we originally planned. And I know that I've missed you more than I thought possible." Alexander was quiet for several minutes, clearly wrestling with his own emotions and decisions. Finally, he spoke. "I can't come back to the palace and pretend nothing has changed. Too much has happened, too much has been said. But I also can't abandon the people who need help." Edward nodded. "What are you proposing?" "Let me continue the work I'm doing in the provinces, but with official support. Create a new role, something that acknowledges both my experience and my changed status. Let me serve the kingdom in the way that makes the most sense now." It wasn't the reconciliation Edward had hoped for, but it was a path forward that honored both their needs and the kingdom's welfare. "And between us?" Edward asked hesitantly. Alexander met his gaze directly. "Between us, we start over. Not as king and heir, but as two people who care about each other and about Aldoria. Maybe we can't go back to being father and son, but we can find a way forward that honors what we meant to each other." Edward extended his hand, and after a moment's hesitation, Alexander shook it. It wasn't an embrace or a declaration of renewed love, but it was a beginning. As they prepared to leave the chapel, Edward made one final confession. "Alexander, I want you to know that regardless of what the genetic tests showed, you became the best of what I hoped to pass on to the next generation. Biology may have failed us, but our relationship succeeded in creating someone worthy of leading." Alexander smiled for the first time since their reunion began. Then maybe that's enough to build on. The crisis that had torn apart the royal family of Aldoria was far from resolved. But in a simple chapel in the countryside, a king and the young man he had raised found a way to begin healing the wounds their truth had created. The kingdom would move forward with a changed succession, a new understanding of what made someone worthy of service, and the knowledge that sometimes the most important bonds transcend biology. The final part of this royal drama ended not with restoration of what was lost, but with the creation of something new, a relationship built on choice rather than blood, service rather than inheritance, and love that could survive even the most devastating truths.